Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to SUMA Convention. Everybody had a good afternoon so far? Yeah? Great. Wonderful. Just wanted to make a quick note. I know everybody's, we got our iPads and our iPhones out. Make sure you have them on vibrate or silent during the meeting so that nobody's interrupted. My name is Dawn Looning. I'm a city councillor with the City of Moose Jaw and one of your SUMA board of directors. And before we get into the session, I want to quickly note that the fire exits, evacuation plan, and the AED location, and I always wonder, what does AED stand for, Sean? See, he doesn't even know. And it's in my notes, and I can't tell you what it means. AED location are marked on pages 26 to 29 of your Convention 2017 handbook. Obviously, it's the emergency exit plan if something of an emergency occurs, so please be familiar with that. We want to make sure that our delegates are safe in an emergency situation, so when you have a minute, just please pay attention to that information. And expect to be reminded of this a few more times throughout convention. Your safety is very important to us. So please note that this session is being audio recorded. That means that if you want to ask a question, you need to go to the mic in the center of the room, identify yourself and your municipality, and speak clearly into the microphone when asking your question. Using the mic means that everyone in the room can hear you, including our speaker, and that the question is on the recording. Later this month, the presentations will be available on the SUMA YouTube channel, and we want those recordings to be a good resource, so we need all of your questions recorded. I'm not going to read the biography of our presenter today because that time can be better spent listening to her speak. For those of you with Eventbase, the free app we use for convention, the bios are available there if you're interested. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Terri Harris, Vice President, Harris Greenaway Communications. Thank you for joining us today, delegates, and please give Terri a very warm welcome.
Thanks, Dawn, and thank you to Sean and SUMA for the invitation to speak to you today. It's an honor, actually, to be here in this room and have been asked to speak to you, to municipal leaders who have stepped up to represent your community. I know how much of a commitment that is, time for your community, perhaps away from your families, and I really want to thank you for the work you do for building your communities and helping to build our province. Some of you may know that I spent 15 years working for the government of Saskatchewan, 8 years with the Saskatchewan Party in official opposition, and then 7 in the Premier's office after the Saskatchewan Party formed government in 2007. This time in both opposition and government at the very highest level, combined with my years in previous experience in the Saskatchewan media and in the nonprofit sector, has given me many insights in how organizations and individuals approach government, what they do right, what they do wrong, and how the bureaucracy and politicians react in a variety of circumstances. In my role with the Wall government, I had a seat at the cabinet table, so I witnessed firsthand the debate that takes place at that table, the considerations of the ministers, the senior political staff, and the ministry officials, and ultimately, how decisions were made. Based on this, I believe I'm well positioned to offer you some thought today that I hope may help empower you as municipalities, and perhaps help you in any outreach you may undertake with the provincial or the federal government. You are not alone in questioning why governments make some of the decisions they do, or more often than not, why they aren't moving in a direction that seems to make sense, or why it can take a long time for a decision to be made. I have a client, an organization in the health field, who I'm going to refer to at times during my presentation today. We've been working with them for just over a year, but they've been lobbying the provincial government for legislative change for over 10 years, through 2 different political parties in government. And finally, they're making progress because they've embarked on a strategic, thorough advocacy plan. I hope by offering you some greater insight and understanding today of what goes on behind the scenes in government, and offering some strategies to help you help the government, you may not only achieve success with your government relations, but also perhaps achieve it sooner. In every organization, goals are important, whether they be for budgeting, performance, productivity. Setting goals helps everyone know what results they're working toward. And the same goes for your relationship with government. It's important to know what you want to achieve and then determine the best strategy to help you get there. An effective government relations plan should be more than about attending a few events each year with members of the provincial government, or touching base now and then with your local elected official you're friendly with. It should include careful thought and planning by establishing your objectives, determining how best to communicate your issue, planning your strategy, and then implementing that strategy with consistent messaging and follow-up. Many organizations only work on a government relations plan when they have an issue of concern before them. Perhaps they need financial assistance, legislation or regulatory change, or the government is making a change that seriously impacts you. That's fine and may work out for you, but it is never as easy achieving success when you perhaps have limited time to communicate with the people you need to in an organization as large as a provincial or federal government. Those organizations that build relationships and spend the time regularly communicating with government often have a much easier time raising concerns or being consulted with and heard than those who only reached out when they need something. Even if you don't think your municipality really needs to get in front of the government for anything particular at this time, at least determining what your priorities are will help you communicate with the government should you have or need the opportunity. Establishing your objectives for any serious annual government relations plan is job one. Time spent preparing a well-defined agenda of public policy issues important to your municipality is time well spent. Many of you likely have built good relationships with your local MLAs and perhaps meet with them regularly. If not, that's a very good practice to get into. They do appreciate being aware and informed of what their local governments are undertaking or any issues you are having. And rest assured that information is shared with their caucus and cabinet colleagues on many occasions, both formal and informal in the legislature. I witnessed it frequently, especially when the Legislative Assembly wasn't sitting, when the governing caucus was together for the first time perhaps in weeks or months. And the Premier would say, let's go around the room, tell me what you're hearing. Tell me what's going on in your constituency. And that was an opportunity for the MLA to then talk about many of your communities and tell the rest of his colleagues, his or her colleagues, what was going on. If your council has a set of defined objectives you wish to keep in front of the government throughout the year, then anytime you or members of your council or your staff have the opportunity to speak to your local official, you're all delivering the same message then. You're all on the same page. How do you establish your objectives? Consider what you're interested in. Do you have infrastructure needs, concerns over crime or policing, or municipal revenue sharing? Would policy or regulation change benefit your organization? Or do you have an issue with existing or planned government programming? And it doesn't always have to be an ask. Believe me, the government's like that. Would you like to let the government know about your own programming or municipal partnerships or an initiative you're undertaking that they might be interested in? Do you have economic or social programming projects that they may like to share in championing? Spending time as a municipal organization narrowing down and focusing your objectives will help you build a strong government relations plan overall. There are some things you should consider when working to establish your objectives, and the first is, what is success? If it's legislative change, be specific about what that change needs to be. If it's taxation policy change, again, be as specific as possible about what the change you want to achieve is. Do you want the government to fund a major infrastructure project? More police officers? Why? Be specific. Be specific and be realistic about what exactly achieving your objective looks like. And by realistic, I refer you to the second consideration. Evaluate the environment. One example of evaluating the environment is the fiscal situation of the province, which we're hearing a lot about these days. Is there a cost to the provincial treasury for your objective? Let's say one of the objectives you want to lobby for is to ask the government to reduce the PST because your jurisdiction neighbors a jurisdiction with no provincial sales tax, and you believe this would be an economic benefit to your community. When the provincial government is in a serious deficit situation, is that realistic? Not likely. So I remind you, be realistic about your ask. And is that a worthwhile objective if you have other objectives? Such as, what if another objective is to ask the government to fund a major overpass at the entrance of your growing community onto the major provincial highway next to it? Evaluation of the environment tells you that yes, the fiscal situation of the province is very tight, but there are also federal infrastructure dollars that may be leveraged to assist with construction at this time. And there are other factors, the pros and cons to consider, such as public safety. Traffic counts at this highway interchange, because your community is vastly growing, are rising every month, along with a number of serious motor vehicle accidents at the intersection. There are many costs, both locally and provincially, associated with those accidents in emergency response, insurance, health care, and personal loss. Another pro is the cost to build that overpass now are anticipated to be much less than 4 or 5 years from now. But a con against that objective might be that the interchange will divert traffic away from an older established business area of community and a residential sub-area of your community. And so there's some local opposition. Those are all examples of evaluating the environment of your objectives. And the final consideration is timelines. Again, be realistic with your expectations. Legislative or regulatory change may be easier to achieve than a highway overpass or a reduction in the PST because it may not have a fiscal implication for the government. But many other issues can factor into a government's willingness to enact that change, and I'll discuss that as we go through my presentation. That said, setting timelines with your objectives will help you stay focused and help provide context when you approach the government. Once you know what your objectives are, it's time to determine how best to communicate them. Whatever your objectives, make sure they are well articulated. Be specific about what you are seeking or sharing. Back it up with well-researched, current, and well-articulated documentation that supports your objective, and offer solutions. The organizations often most successful with requests of government are those that propose a potential solution. A pathway that helps the government get where you want them to go, removes any obstacles, and makes the decision as easy as possible for them. When preparing to communicate your objective to the government, it's extremely important to really know your stuff. The politician or staff member you're speaking to may be familiar with the issue or your request, or they may have very limited knowledge or no knowledge of it at all. The more prepared you are, the more information and work you've done to help them easily understand and grasp the issue, the more receptive they will be because they will have an easier time moving your request to the next stage. Much of the information you may present will have come from your examination of the environment. Express why your issue is important, who it impacts. Does it require less government involvement or more, and in what ways? Is there public support for it, or a compelling need? Are other jurisdictions moving, or have they moved where you'd like this government to go? Is there a cost savings that can be demonstrated, or does it help with competitiveness? Does your ask fit with the public policy agenda of the government? Can it help them move their agenda forward? That's an important consideration on an issue where politics can come into play. Depending on the issue and the government's stance, it may be an advantage or a disadvantage to you. Again, you will have determined that through your evaluation of the environment. But let me give you an example to demonstrate what I mean. The provincial government is often lobbied for funding for municipal projects. It's well known that the Wall government advocates for municipal cooperation and implemented its own P3 or public-private partnership strategy. If you approach them for project funding with other municipal partners and a construction plan that follows a P3 model, you can point out to them that it helps promote their agenda. They may offer a more favorable response to your request than a project that only benefits one municipality and is funded solely by public money. That's one example of how you should consider a government's own direction or agenda when determining your best approach. Knowing your stuff also means knowing your opposition. You may not be the only stakeholder discussing a particular issue with the government. And while I'll discuss strategic alliances later, knowing who may agree with your stance and also who may be lobbying the government against it is important. You need to be prepared to respond to the government if they ask you about information your opponents may be giving them. Part of knowing your stuff and building the case to help the government help you is also preparing strong supporting materials. Depending on your strategy, which we'll discuss a little later, these may include a briefing note, a PowerPoint presentation, other documentation, or marketing materials. The key to these is to make sure they are current, well-researched, factual, and short. Less is more. I want to drive that point home by reminding you that the wall cabinet has gone paperless. And you, as members of municipal councils, I know probably also feel frustration at times if you have too much paper to go through in preparation for your meetings. All provincial cabinet correspondence is now done on iPads. And it was very early in the first term, after receiving reams of printed information for cabinet decision items, binders of material, as was the tradition at the time, that the Premier issued the directive that no cabinet decision item would be longer than 3 pages. There could be attachments and appendixes, but if you couldn't describe the decision, its implications, its cost, and its comms plan in 3 pages, it was sent back. We make every effort to ensure that our clients go into government meetings with a handout summarizing the objective that is no more than 2 or 3 pages. There may be additional information that can be left with them for supporting documentation. There may be opportunity for a PowerPoint in a longer session or a consultation, but if you can't summarize your official request in 2 or 3 pages, you risk losing their interest quickly. All of this preparation of the background materials and information to support communicating your objective will have a huge impact on the success of your strategy. Earlier, I mentioned an organization we work on behalf of who've been lobbying the government for legislative change for over a decade. They have long had the same objective and had been communicating reasonably well and often with the government. But only after they sat down and developed a stronger communication approach with supporting materials did they really begin to see progress. There are 2 components of a strong strategic approach: government outreach, consisting of well-planned, timely events, meetings, and outreach to elected government members and ministry officials, and public relations. And this is often the path that people forget about and don't pay enough attention to as part of their government relations plan. Yet it is often nearly, if not as important, as all of your work to communicate with the government. And I'll go through each of these areas separately. First of all, when approaching the provincial government about an issue or with a request, you have to understand how the government works, how decisions are made, who the decision makers are, and who is influential to those decision makers. Determine who you need to talk to in government, and then figure out how to get in front of them with your issue. There are a number of ways that can be done. Formal meetings at the provincial or constituency level, educational presentations to legislative or caucus committees, deputy ministers' meetings, ministries' meetings, or social events or tours of the ministers or the MLAs of your project or your community that you can organize, such as receptions, or by attending industry or municipal events or political events. But determining who can best move your issue ahead in the government is key. So it's important early to know who you need to get in front of. Don't forget, however, that they can be influenced by others. The Premier may lead the government, but the decisions are made at the cabinet table where several other ministers may influence that decision. I've seen that happen many times, where a minister has brought an initiative to the cabinet table, but questions from the other members who had heard something else or needed more information either derailed that decision completely or at least set it back. Those ministers and the Premier also regularly receive feedback from their caucus colleagues based on meetings they are having. letters or phone calls they receive from constituents, or even what they hear from the public on coffee roll or while attending events. And don't forget the opposition caucus as well, who also can influence a government decision if they raise enough opposition, or even better, if they offer support for your idea. Many organizations just focus on the government members and don't realize that if you can get the opposition on side with your issue, that makes the decision easier for the government because they know they aren't going to be criticized publicly. An example of this is with requests for change in legislation or regulation. If you have the government on side but slow to move, getting the opposition on side can help. If they stand up and present petitions signed by Saskatchewan people also supporting your request, if they make member statements or call on the government to support the change you are advocating, they can't then turn around and criticize the government when it happens. This can make your path to success easier. I can offer you a concrete example of how to cover all the bases with your government contacts. The healthcare group requesting the legislative change has obviously been meeting with the Minister of Health and Ministry of Health officials for years. But we've expanded that to include the Minister of Justice and Attorney General, because the need for legislation has a component of public protection and safety and legal implications for practitioners. Gaining his support helps the Minister of Health gather broader cabinet support for the legislation when it gets to that table. There's also an advanced education component because the legislation will impact the technical schools training the practitioners. Having the Minister of Advanced Education supporting the legislation and prepared to speak to the issue to the owners of the technical schools is also important. In addition, the group has met with or written to members of the government caucus to educate them on the reasons for the request for legislation, and also to counter any opposition or concerns those MLAs may hear from those in the industry who don't see the need for government regulation of their practice. And they've met with the opposition caucus, who have supported their call for legislation. The opposition members have presented petitions in the legislature calling for the legislation to be introduced. It's a well-rounded approach to cover all of the bases, educating and advocating with anyone in government who may have influence on the final decision, instead of just one minister or the premier, and that will help you make progress. Once you've determined who you want to speak with and that a formal meeting with them is part of your strategy, it's time to plan for that meeting. Again, there are some considerations. With each meeting, make sure you know that person's role in the government and what impact they will have on the premier, the minister, the cabinet, or others. How can they help you achieve your objective? That information will then help you plan your approach and messaging for the meeting itself. Then, decide who is best to represent your organization. Sometimes this is difficult. It should be your strongest spokespeople. Sometimes organizations send in a person who perhaps knows the politician best, who's a golf buddy, or who is the chair of the committee leading the issue. But they may not necessarily represent you the best on that occasion. So that's a strategic decision that can make or break your meeting, and it's an important one. Make your meeting request directly with the office of the person you want to meet with. Ideally, this should be done in writing, so there's a record of it received by the office, and then it should be followed up with a telephone call to ensure they received it and to offer any answers to questions they may have. Doing this in writing as well gives you the first opportunity to explain your issue and the why, and why you're requesting the meeting. Be flexible with your dates and the time of day. Recognize that these offices, especially the Premier and the Ministers, receive hundreds of requests for meetings or to attend events on a weekly basis. Certainly it makes sense to offer a range of dates to accommodate your people, but be as flexible as you can, or offer to go to them. Sometimes if it's easier to meet with them in their home community or their home constituency if it's close to you than to go to Regina. Offering them convenience makes it easier for them to say yes to your request. When you receive a meeting date, time, and location, confirm it promptly, let them know who is attending on your behalf, and if at all possible, don't schedule or ask to reschedule. Show up promptly and be prepared. I can tell you from experience that government members and officials get very tired of meetings. Bureaucracies are famous for having meetings to discuss having more meetings. So make sure if you request a meeting that with government members or officials that there is a good purpose to it, that you are prepared and you make good use of your time with them. It will be much easier for you to have that meeting and be approved for more meetings down the road if you need them, if you've gone in with a purpose to start with, and if those officials don't leave that feeling like you've wasted their time. Often you will have a limited amount of time for a meeting, 30 minutes to an hour if you're lucky. But ministers may often be called out or have to leave earlier than scheduled, and I've seen this many times, both as a government staffer and in my work now, where you have an hour meeting planned and it's been booked for many months, but 10 or 15 minutes into it, especially during the legislative session when ministers are very, very busy, all of a sudden a staff member whips in, whispers in the minister's ear, and they apologize and have to make an exit. So it's important that you get down to business quickly and make your case in the first half of the meeting. A lot of very useful time, especially at the start of the meeting, is often wasted on small talk. Save that for the end if you want to visit. Make sure you know what your agenda is and make it as concise and specific as possible. Have it written and printed out for you on the table in front of you if you like. Make quick introductions of your group, distribute your business cards and your materials, but then get down to business. State your objective and present your case. Outline your ask. Let them know that you understand the environment by speaking to financial challenges, potential opposition, and offer solutions. Discuss your timelines, when you'd like this to happen and why, and then listen. Allow them to ask questions and offer feedback. And it's during that time when you will often get the most clues about what a government is thinking about your issue and where they may go. And last but not least, thank everyone in person as you're leaving, and a day or two after the meeting, send a written email or letter of thanks to everyone who attended. This is not only a nice touch, but it gives you the opportunity to again make your case, to remind the officials of your discussion, to offer to work with them on advancing your issue, to express understanding of what you heard from them during the meeting, and to request follow-up. Another component of effective government relations is timing. Understanding the legislative and political cycles of governments is tremendously helpful. Why? Because where a government is in either of these cycles can determine whether or not they will move on your issue or how quickly. The legislative cycle is set according to the province's fiscal year, which begins April 1st. In the first quarter, you have the spring legislative session when all the politicians are in Regina. During that session, the provincial budget is debated, legislation that was introduced the previous fall is debated and passed, and generally there is much media and public focus on the government and the issues of the day. This is also a time that decisions and directives from the budget introduced in March are implemented, and initial planning for the next budget cycle begins. During the second quarter of July through September, any legislative changes considered by ministries that need to be introduced in the third quarter are developed. New legislation is drafted, and early financial and budgetary projections are made in preparation for the call to estimates. All of this is presented to Cabinet late in the second quarter so they can set their direction for the budget planning period and the fall session. During the third quarter, from October through the end of the calendar year, the government finalizes any legislative changes or new legislation they intend to introduce. They issue a call for estimates so ministries can prepare their budget submissions for the coming year. The government finalizes the speech from the throne, which signals the direction the government will take in the coming year, and the fall session of the legislature begins. This session kicks off with the throne speech and lasts approximately 6 weeks, during which the government introduces any legislation amendments or new legislation into the House. The last quarter of the year, which is the period we're in now, involves the heavy work of ministries, Treasury Board, and Cabinet to finalize the budget. Most of this work is completed by mid-February. The budget speech is written and the spring legislative session begins in March. All of this is helpful to understand because if you're making a request of the government that has significant budget implications, approaching them in the last quarter likely will not mean success. You need to get to them in the first or second quarter, so you have time to introduce the idea and then continue advocating for it through the months leading up to budget finalization. The same can be said for legislative changes. If you approach the government in November, you should assume you will have to wait until at least the following November before you see anything introduced. It would have to be an issue of pressing urgency for the government to introduce and pass a legislative change in the spring session. While not as important necessarily to the ultimate success of your government relations plan, sometimes where a governing party is at in the political cycle does have an impact. Frankly, the closer a government is to an election, the less likely they are to introduce a legislative change that may be controversial. So depending on what you're advocating for, understanding the political cycle can inform your decisions related to timelines and strategies. As you know, the political cycle for provincial or federal government is 5 years. Year one of the political cycle is the year immediately after the election, when the governing party has a new mandate. Much of their direction can be determined based on what they committed to during the election campaign and the fiscal situation of the province. This is a time where you may have new cabinet ministers and MLAs to build relationships with, and political parties may be undergoing evaluation or internal renewal based on their electoral success or lack of it. Year 2 and 3 are the years when the government focuses mostly on delivering on their mandate. But if they're going to make moves of significant change, this is when it will occur, because they have time to strengthen their position again prior to the next election. By the end of year 3 and into year 4, the political parties are beginning to think about the next election and position themselves accordingly. The government usually doesn't undertake anything controversial during this time because they want to portray a strong and steady hand on the ship. The opposition will try to increase focus and public scrutiny on any issues of concerns and stake out their own positions in an attempt to grab public attention. That's the general political cycle, and understanding this can sometimes offer you insight on what a government does or doesn't do when they don't do something that you thought they were leaning toward. It can be useful in developing your strategy. Now I want to move on to discussion about the second path of good advocacy strategy, and that's public relations. I love this quote from former US President Franklin Roosevelt. "Okay, you've convinced me. Now go out there and bring pressure on me." In my former role, I often heard frustration from the Premier and elected members, and I felt it myself, when organizations or individuals would ask the government for something, yet they weren't prepared to stand up themselves and publicly speak to the position. Sometimes they were scared of opposition, or they felt they had to remain behind the scenes in case they were perceived to be favoring one political party over the other. Or they didn't see it as their role, perhaps. Yet they were adamant that the government should take a certain action. Let me tell you, nothing frustrates a government more than that. They may want to support your ask and be willing to step up, but may be deterred if they feel they're the only ones sticking their neck out. If you want to be taken seriously and convince the government to move in a certain direction, then the more public support you offer and the more you are willing to lead the parade, the better. They'll respond much faster, usually, if you're willing to do that. One example of not leading the parade I would offer is our national energy sector. While the energy industry has been actively lobbying provincial and federal governments for years on oil sand development or pipeline approvals, they were not publicly active in promoting their sector, its value to Canadians, and their own environmental stewardship. The void of public information allowed opponents of pipeline development and the oil sands to grab the public agenda and the headlines, and caused governments to move more slowly and cautiously with their decision-making processes, and certainly not be willing to speak up necessarily in support of the industry due to the environment of controversy and opposition. I'd argue that if the energy sector had undertaken strong public advocacy and education long ago to increase public support for their industry and minimize opposition, at the same time as they were lobbying the government, those approvals from the government may have been easier to grant. To lead a parade, you need to stage one, and this is done by developing strategic alliances. Your most obvious alliances are with other stakeholders. Take the time to think about who may support your ask of the government. Will they do the same with their own advocacy? Or will they endorse you in your request with a letter of support? Governments will always consult with other stakeholders before they act. So the more you can bring other stakeholders on side with your position, the greater your chance of convincing the government to support your request. The time you spend working with other stakeholders to build consensus and agreement to support your objective is almost, if not as important as your government relations activities. Because any sign of controversy or disagreement can cause a government to not support your objective, or at minimum will certainly delay approval. That's what happened to our healthcare client prior to them working with us. The government had drafted legislation and sent it out for consultation. They thought the government was finally going to introduce the legislation they'd long been lobbying for. But some in their industry opposed to regulation began lobbying against it, writing letters to MLAs, and circulating misinformation about what the legislation would mean to practitioners. This, combined with the upcoming provincial election, caused the government to pause, and they didn't introduce it. So, part of their work since has been trying to build alliances with other stakeholders in their industry, working through any areas of disagreement to reach consensus, educating practitioners, and seeking support and endorsement from legislation from other professional health organizations who work hand in hand with them. The second way to build alliances is with public relations. If you have a membership or constituents and regularly undertake marketing activities to keep them informed, then use those means to educate them and ask their support for your objective. And even go further by asking them to speak to others or contact their local MLA or government representative. Use your newsletters, your social media accounts, your public meetings, and your regular public contacts to inform, educate, and build support. Any proof you gather of public support can then be offered to the government. And remember, if MLAs are hearing support or opposition to an issue from public feedback, that can help or hurt your chances of reaching your objective. Again, you're building a parade. Our health organization is actively undertaking public relations by distributing posters calling for legislation to their members that they can display in their businesses, using social media posts to educate the public and call for the legislation, displaying their petition calling for legislation on their website, and have produced a backdrop display and brochure for distribution to the public anytime they have the opportunity to present it. And in fact, I think they are here in your trade show this week. Thirdly, consider how to use media to your advantage. If you have a great relationship with your local weekly newspaper editor, consider meeting with them to discuss the issue and ask them to write a story. Or consider contributing your own opinion piece to the paper, advocating for your issue or your request. Use them to help educate and build public support. Depending on the issue, there are other ways media relations can play an important role. You can proactively issue a news release or hold a news conference if there's a compelling reason to highlight your issue. And I'll go back to the overpass I mentioned earlier. If traffic safety counts are rising and MVAs are rising, you have reason to perhaps hold a news conference and issue a release that explains that issue to people, which in turn helps you build public support for it and informs the government about the issue. You may act to media stories as well on that issue. For example, our health group responded recently publicly to media stories about a practitioner who was recently charged criminally. They were able to use that situation to speak to the need for legislation and regulation for protection of the public. This helps them raise public awareness of their issue and increase demand on the government to take action. Media relations can be used to challenge the government, and while that should be done carefully, because there is risk to publicly criticizing a government when you're asking them for support, if done right, it can be done successfully to help you achieve your goals. There are other tactics to consider as well, such as buying advertising with the media to educate the public and advocate for your position, using legislative tools such as public petitions or holding an MLA lobby day or reception, launching marketing campaigns online or with more traditional means, holding public events, conducting public opinion polling research. All of those, depending on your objectives, are tactics that can be used to help you build your case and increase your chance of success. Once you've established your objectives, determined how best to communicate them, and laid out your strategic plan, it's time to implement it. Prepare your messaging, hold your meetings, build your alliances, and start the parade. Sometimes change comes from the government, as we're all hearing now, as the government is talking about regional health authorities and school boards and the fiscal situation. But most often, it comes to the government. And while much of my time today was spent talking about preparing to implement your government relations plan, the continuation of it is just as important. Once you've had your meetings and started the parade, you have to keep it going. This is done by looking for opportunities to reinforce your message in follow-up conversations or meetings, remaining consistent with your messaging and your ask, sending them updated information if you have it, and maintaining the relationships you've built. Most organizations fail to achieve their objectives because they took their foot off the gas. They stopped their advocacy and allowed the government to forget about their issue. Or they let opposition or public controversy grab the agenda. If you take time to convince a government to make a public policy change or a major financial decision, it can be done if you are prepared, consistent, and persistent in your efforts. One meeting or discussion isn't enough. Stay in front of them so you are top of mind. You never know when what you've shared with them is remembered as a result of something else an MLA or a government official comes across. And one example that comes to mind for me recently was we'd been meeting with a client in the construction, or representing a client in the construction sector with a cabinet minister. It was indirectly related to his file. But then a few months later, he was touring the North Battleford Hospital, Saskatchewan Hospital, and in viewing that, he remembered what we'd been discussing with our client at that meeting, and he mentioned that to me after the fact that, wow, that came back to me. It made a lot of sense seeing things firsthand. The health organization we're working with has been diligently communicating their support for legislation of their practice with the government. They've been raising public awareness, educating the public, their practitioners, and other relevant stakeholders, and building alliances. They've been flexible and they've negotiated. And the government now has indicated they do intend to proceed with the legislation, and we're optimistic that will happen this fall. In the meantime, however, all of our efforts continue because until it's passed, they haven't achieved their goal. All of the information I shared today may seem overwhelming, and certainly in some organizations with limited staff or time, taking on effective government relations can be kind of a daunting idea. Most organizations do this only during a time of crisis or when they determine there's a compelling need for government help. But let me tell you that with forward thinking and an ongoing government relations strategy, even if your ask might be 5 or 10 years down the road, it takes a long time to turn a government ship. So start now, and you can achieve gains on a consistent basis. And should a crisis hit or an urgent need arise in the meantime, you are much better positioned to seek help or assistance given your ongoing relationship with the government. This is where people like myself and companies like ours, or organizations like SUMA, can help you. I'm not intending to make a blatant pitch for my company here, but as someone who's been on both sides of this, I can tell you that having a person who knows who to talk to, who knows the government agenda, and all the nuances and considerations that I've outlined in the points I've spoken to today can save an organization a lot of time and frustration. And while there is a cost sometimes for government relations support, if it helps you achieve your goals sooner, that time saved turns into money saved and greater progress for your community in the long run. If you want your organizations and your issues to stand out and be compelling enough to catch the government's attention amid all of the meetings and all of the people and requests before elected members and their officials on any given day, it's worth your while to give careful consideration and spend time making the development of an annual government relations plan a priority in your business planning cycle. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have today.
Hello, Dennis Novoselsky from Prince Albert. I appreciated some of the comments you made, but I guess one of the parts that rings raw with me is a lot of times provincial, federal, municipal leaders also got to have the courage to introduce change, not sit back and take 5 or 10 years. And I'll give you one example. To change the law to have no smoking in public places in Saskatchewan Moose Jaw, Yorkton, and Prince Albert led the crusade for years to push that issue of the health benefits, the lives saved, reduction in health costs. The governments, and both opposition and government in power, sat on the fence because they didn't have the guts to take the leadership role. And I'll give you one other example. 2 years ago, I asked for an amendment of the Health Human Tissue Act, where we could use cadaver lungs in public demonstrations to show students the dangers of smoking and the health costs and the damage from that. 2 years ago, and the government, opposition, or government in power provincially has done nothing. And I just think sometimes it shouldn't have to wait till everybody in the province is behind it. We need some leaders that will lead. I'm just sharing that balance.
And that's part of what I spoke to in building the parade. And sometimes government will get out there, but let's take the smoking example for an issue. I know the Cancer Agency and the Lung Association were all advocating for that as well. But those MLAs are out in Coffee Row, and they're hearing from people in their communities that are going, well, you can't do this here, or you've got the local bar owner lobbying them and saying, that'll kill my business. So you just have to recognize that there's lots of opinions out there, and the stronger you can build the parade behind your cause, usually the easier it is for governments to make that decision and stick their neck out. They like to lead a parade if you start it. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
But they're happy to join it. But that's when I talk about using all the tools in your strategy, not just meetings and asking the government to do it, but building as much support for your ask as possible.
I want to end by putting one plug in because there's an audience here, an audience that can help us get the provincial government to do this one change. In Alberta, I worked in health in Alberta, and I wanted to use cadaver lungs in public demonstrations to schools on the health risks of smoking. I had no problem to go to the hospital, ask for the human cadaver lungs, emphysema lungs, cancerous lungs. They said, what a great idea, do it. I came here with the same suggestion, and the government, that former health minister, wrote me back through his assistant and said, there has to be an amendment to the act so we can't do it. I wrote back and says, that's why you're there, amend the act and we can do it. That was 2 years ago, so I want to ask him in question period this time around, but I encourage any citizens here representing all the towns, villages, and cities to put some pressure on government to give that amendment for public education. Put those 3 words in the act, and if we can bring the incidence of smoking down in Saskatchewan and cut that 48–50% of our budget goes into health care, and the number of people that are dying from emphysema, heart problems, cancer, it makes me shocked. They can't see it so obvious. But again, you don't want to turn off 20% of people that might smoke and support us. Oh God, they're getting tough. It's a health initiative that we can do something about. So I encourage some support from the delegates here. Thank you.
It's all about, thanks Dennis. It is all about building the case. And I will say this, I was asked in the first session today, you know, what some of the top of mind cases that come to mind for me were, and I had a sign, recognize it's not always the politicians, because they're getting information from their officials as well, that may or may not support what you're asked. You might find the minister says, well, this makes sense to me, I want to proceed with that. But his officials have all sorts of reasons why it can't be done. I used to have a sticker on my door down there in the legislature that said, it can't be done, and it had a big red X through it, because honestly, I hate to say it, but oftentimes there is more of a can't do attitude or a reason to resist a change from the ministries than there is at the political level. So that's why I talk about covering all your bases and knowing who influences the actual decision makers and making sure you're talking to as many people as possible and that your messaging is consistent. Any other questions? If not, I'm going to be around for a little bit, so you can come speak to me privately too. But thank you again very much for the audience today.
Thank you very much, Terri. Just so you all know, Terri has done back-to-back presentations on this very valuable topic today. So I just want to take an opportunity to have you all thank Terri again for being here. And on behalf of the members and the SUMA Board of Directors, I have a thank you card for you. Thanks, Terri, so much. So just a couple of things. Remember, the presentations are going to be available on SUMA's YouTube channel later this month. And for those of you attending tonight's welcome reception, we will see you at O'Brien's Event Center at 8 o'clock. And the opening ceremonies begin tomorrow promptly at 8:30. So have a wonderful evening. I know there's a couple other things happening now in the agenda, so might see you there. I know the newcomers orientation is happening at 4:20, I believe, and I'm involved in that one as well. So have a great convention, and we'll see